And welcome to our next session with Matt Dickson. Matt, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Brian?
I'm good. I'm doing really well. I'm honestly excited about this, and I think to share with the audience, one thing that Matt and I were talking about before was Matt kind of comes at this from some data, and that's a little different from other sessions, and this is what excites me honestly. And he'll share a little bit about like the data that he's pulling from certain reports. But before all of that, Matt, tell us a little bit about Eclipse Telecom, as well as a little bit about how you got into CX in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I'll try not to bore anyone with too much data. So
Oh
hopefully
no.
we'll keep it interesting, engaging. Never let a guy with a master's in data analytics in the room because that's all we want to talk about. But we'll be talking about a ton of CX as well. So we like to help people make informed decisions based on data as opposed to what you feel is right. It's better to really have that data to guide you. So my role at Eclipse is I'm the chief operating officer, but also the head of our CX. And prior to joining Eclipse, kind of talking about that journey, many moons ago, I won't date myself here. We'll maybe do a poll later to see how old people think I am. But many moons ago, I started in the contact center as an agent many years ago. So throughout the years, I've held lots of different technology CX roles. Right before joining Eclipse, by the way, I was an Eclipse customer. Maybe that's the
Oh,
greatest commercial ever. I was an
there you
Eclipse
go.
customer that came to work for Eclipse. But prior to joining to Eclipse, I was running a division within Stericycle called Communication Solutions. So if people know Stericycle, they may know Medwaste or Shred It. They had a
Okay.
division that was focused on patient engagement. I was running that division for the last 3 years prior to joining Eclipse. So I started there in 2019, and then that division was actually divested of at the end of 2022. We
Okay.
were powering parts of the patient journey for 8 of the top 10 largest health systems in the country. We're doing 300,000 interactions a day across 3 SaaS platforms. And I also had a contact center, about 600 plus agents doing 2 million calls a year. And about 1 million of those were very complex scheduling calls. So
Wow.
I'm proud to say in the time I was there, we were pretty well recognized within the industry for what we were doing. So we won a Frost and Sullivan Award for best values and best practices in patient engagement, a Globee Disruptor Award. And I was very honored to be named a 2020 Healthcare Communicator of the Year as well. So bringing some of that experience forward now
Yeah.
and helping other companies leverage some of that experience I brought along with some of the technical and certainly AI background I have is really the focus of what Eclipse does and what I'm doing with Eclipse.
That's perfect. And one call out, just we've only talked a little bit, Matt, but I could see that a lot of this comes from a position of like you actually really care about what you're doing, and you really want to understand like how to create a good experience, and it really shows, honestly.
Well, I appreciate it. We try our best. Let's put it that way.
There you go. Well, let's just dig into it. So I don't want to scare many people about oh, here comes the data, but I will share that like the in the very first conversation of ours, you brought up something super interesting to me, which was the Forrester report specifically about customer experience. And from what I recall, you shared that for the last 2 years, CX scores have been going down. Now, one, tell me if I got that right, and then help us expand on that and what that means, let's say, to you in this case.
Yeah, no, certainly you got that right. And I think the important part of that is that's unprecedented for them. So Forrester does this survey every year, and they go out and talk to 96,000 US consumers across 221 different brands and 13 industries. So they've been doing this for quite a long time. And for 2022 and 2023, it is the first time that they've basically create a score out of it. They call it CX Index. That's the first time in their history that they've seen performance drop year over year for 2 years in a row. So looking back at 2022, they measure across 3 areas: ease, effectiveness, and emotion.
Okay.
So in 2022, that drop that we saw was largely attributed to that emotional component or the performance across creating positive emotions for consumers. In 2023, we actually saw that score drop across all three areas. So part of what you and I talked about is we talked about, what do we want to, discuss during this webinar? I think where people are struggling is how do you create emotion in digital interactions? We all know digital interactions are becoming more and more prevalent. And I think this is where we'll spend a lot of time talking today. But let me talk about other kind of few key points within that survey, because I think it's good to have benchmarks.
Sure.
So one of the benchmarks that you see within that survey is that the brands that score very highly from a CX index standpoint, so those elite brands, they average 29 positive emotions created. So these are things like feeling happy, valued, appreciated, for each negative emotion that they create, such as frustration and annoyance, right? So that is the bar for elite brands. That's a 29-to-1 ratio, which I think we all agree that's a pretty high bar to cross. The other thing that I think is very interesting about that report is they also talk to business leaders as part of that report too, CX leaders. And they ask them, how big of a priority is becoming customer obsessed, for example? Or are you going to spend more money to improve your CX? Or how important is improving CX to you? 80% of those business leaders indicated that CX is a high priority for them. So we're seeing this huge disconnect between the amount of emphasis being placed on customer experience or consumer experience from the business side and the way that customers and consumers are actually feeling that experience.
Yeah.
And that disconnect is growing.
Yeah. I just want to call out something that I feel like is really interesting with what you just said. It's usually one or the other when it comes to negative experiences and positive experiences. It seems like you said the 29-to-1 ratio. And as I've talked to the merchants, usually the focus is on like those negative experiences. How can they reduce those? But in your ratio, like it's super important as well to look at it from the positive side. And how can you create way more positive outcomes and just positive experiences? I think that's something that's honestly brand new, especially for the audience here. And maybe is that not? And we'll go on in a second, but I just want to ask you, like, is that not new for you? Have you always kind of seen that, or is that something that hasn't been done?
No, I think it is, right? So we're really seeing this era of personalization being ushered in, which we're going to talk a lot about today. But you're right. That's typically the low hanging fruit, right? Like what is in your face? It's the negative experience.
Yes.
It isn't the positive experience has largely gone unmeasured. And this is where AI is going to help us a lot. And we'll talk about some of that today as well, of helping us measure the entirety of that experience across a much larger number of interactions. So that's part of the reason that's been buried, is you haven't had a good way to judge that, to measure that, to track that. The ones you could track are the complaints.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Those are the easy ones.
Yeah. And from a consumer's perspective, like if you just take 1 second, and we're all consumers, but like look at the world around us right now. There's a lot of like sad things going on, and if you look at your inbox, right, like how many times have you been celebrated from brands in the last few months? And at least in my perspective, it's not many, and so there's definitely an opportunity there to really utilize and start celebrating your own customers and prospects.
And I think you're very right on that point, but this is why I think we're going to stick with this title. We'll see if we change it as we go, but we're talking about this idea of radical personalization. And I think that's part of the problem as well, is this very generalized approach we've taken to celebrating our customers rings hollow if it's not done in a very personalized way, right? And this is more than just, hi, Brian, right? Now, we're talking about a much deeper level of personalization beyond, hey, I was able to stick their first name properly into an email. Which, by the way, sometimes they don't even do that, right?
No. And you know what? I guarantee you, like, I want to talk about radical personalization, but one more question before we get there, Matt, which is you just brought up the reports showing that everyone wants to invest in customer experience. But the scores, again, have been down for the last 2 years. Why is that from your perspective?
Well, there's this little company. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's called Amazon.
Uh-huh.
They're doing this good, maybe bad. I don't know. Depends on where you set, where you think it's good or bad. But they are consistently a brand that performs very, very highly in customer experience surveys. And I'm talking about lots of them, not just one. And the reality is they are setting the benchmark for the world right now. So many US consumers interact with Amazon that when you compare your experiences across anything, whether it's setting a healthcare appointment, purchasing something online, going into a store, whatever it may be, Amazon for most people is what you're comparing it against, right? So when we look at what Amazon's doing, what are they doing that most organizations aren't today? They've shifted the paradigm to very proactive communication. And by the way, I'll mention this a side note, doesn't really fall into what we're talking about today. If you're worried about call deflection in your contact center, the first thing you should be looking at is proactive communication. That is the best way to take calls out of your contact center, because guess what? I just got an Amazon delivery at my door a minute ago. It's 10 stops away. I never have to go look for information, or if I
Yeah.
need it, it's at my fingertips. I know exactly what they're doing. I know exactly where my item is. Very, very simple, very proactive in their approach. So that's certainly a big part of it. Is the bar has been raised. I'd say the other thing that's driving that is we're seeing more money pour into CX, but we've seen this rush to implement AI that I think is backfiring a little bit. It's really that poor implementation of tools.
Hmm.
Here at Eclipse, we jokingly have something we call the 7 deadly sins of self-service. And we'll dive into some of those a bit later. So I won't go into a lot of depth now, but we're definitely seeing businesses run into some predictable potholes on this journey that's really making it a bumpy ride for all. And I'll give
Yeah.
you one shocking example of that. So there's an organization that focuses on eating disorders. They decided to get rid of their contact center and put a chatbot in place. They stopped the chatbot after 1 week. It did not even survive a week because their chatbot was giving advice that to a layman would seem to make sense, like count your calories, right? Do this, do that. All these things triggered eating disorders. So they took a very generalized tool and tried to apply it to a very specific problem, and it backfired spectacularly. So those are the things we mean when we say you need to be conscientious of the way you're implementing these tools, or you will degrade customer experience instead of improving it.
All right. So let's get into it. So you just talked about the brand's emotional performance. Um, their scores were low on that, right? And so, one, kind of help us define that one more time, the brand's emotional performance, and your suggestions and recommendations for how can a brand improve that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's just the emotions they evoke, right? So again, positive would typically be things like delighted, ease of use, all that fun kind of stuff. The negative ones are pretty straightforward to understand, right? You're frustrated, right? You're not getting
Yeah.
what you want. It's too hard to do what you want to do. The first thing we have to acknowledge, though, up front is there's two distinct paths for digital interaction. One is human led, right? So you have people likely sending emails, you have people likely using chat.
Sure.
That's kind of one path. Then the other path is automated digital interactions. So chatbots, for example, or you may even have some AI built that automatically responds to incoming emails, or on we got to worry about social media as well, right? Are you
Right.
replying to Facebook messages? Are you replying to reviews left on Google, for example? All of those things kind of fall under that digital umbrella. But certainly the path to getting better at those things is a little bit different, right? Whether it's people led or completely machine led. So the first place I would start, and I'll give you tip one along our path to personalization, is you have to understand your brand and its voice. So while that may not directly create emotions, it does create consistency in how your brand speaks to and interacts with your customers across all of your interactions. So this ensures that you have a predictable but yet differentiated experience that will help eliminate negative emotions and foster positive ones. So my guess is contact center leaders, we spend a ton of time thinking about our brand's voice when we're training our agents, right?
Yep.
We are not spending very much time thinking about that as we're rolling out purely digital tools such as chatbots, right? So we're seeing that step skipped often. And the reality is what's happening is so many of these tools are leveraging the same large language models, the most popular of those being ChatGPT, that there's this huge flattening going on in that automated interaction space. So you sound like everybody else because you're all using the same tools, right? Underneath the skin there. So you really got to think deeply and carefully about how to interject your brand's voice into those interactions. So for example, is your brand playful? Is it motherly? Is it compassionate? Is it sarcastic? What we often are seeing is just this very vanilla experience that really appears identical across brands as more of these tools are being rolled out, right? So differentiation and personalization are obviously keys to creating positive emotions in your customers. So you really need to think about as you're evaluating these tools, how can you bend them to your brand's voice? This needs to be a very important part of your evaluation process when you look at some of these automated tools is how can you change its tone, its character? Much of this can be done through something called prompt engineering. We won't go down that rabbit hole today, but that really relies in many ways on the consumer to do things differently to get that different tone coming out of it. Let me draw it together real quickly and we'll go
Yeah,
on
this is
to
good.
another point. I'll give you a perfect example. So again, I'll date myself again. We'll play guess my age later. But I came up during an era where in the early 2000s, Bud Light had one of the greatest commercial successes of all time. What's up? Right? This was their brand voice, right? It was pervasive in every commercial. Everybody was doing, every time you answered the phone around that time when your friend called, you were doing the what's up. If they would have rolled out a chatbot that time and it didn't start with what's up, it would have been the greatest missed opportunity for putting your brand voice in automated tools. If it would have started with, hi, thank you for choosing Bud Light. How can I help you? You missed the boat, right? So that's what we
Yeah.
mean when we say, how do you bring your brand voice forward into these automated tools?
I think I think it's a good aha moment, at least for me, and I assume the audience, because I've often heard that people go in the direction of their products and their services being their main differentiator. And really, what these AI tools are doing at the end of the day is putting a lot more importance on the brand. And maybe I'll back up. It's more importance on customer experience, but
Yep.
then how do you stand out in customer experience is really your brand at the end of the day. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If you sound exactly like your competitors, how are you differentiating? Right. If you don't have a distinctive voice, a distinctive take on the world. And I tell you right now, when you lead a contact center, the number of hours you spend training people on what it means to communicate the way that your company wants them to communicate,
Yeah.
right? And down to very sometimes, in my opinion, maybe a little too specific, but very down to very specific things like you need to answer the phone this exact way. But often none of that work is done when we talk about these automated tools.
I mean, just the context of you were just talking about onboarding, like agents, right? Like you have a whole onboarding experience for those agents or just for your employees at a company. It's the same way. If you have an AI bot that is answering customer questions just like an agent would, there needs to be some sort of onboarding experience for that agent. Same thing with email, phone, you name it. It's a good way to think about this, and I really appreciate that insight there. So maybe before we even move on, any other tips about emotional experiences and how you develop those within a brand?
Yeah, Brian, you came onto one instinctively. And part of the reason I say to do this is because it's something that you probably measure today and have access to. Come at it through the back door, which is look, we talked about that ratio 29 positive to every negative one. Sometimes the best approach right now is to mitigate or eliminate those negative emotions, right? So, how do you do that, right? We talked about two negative emotions in particular to start frustration and annoyance. So when we talked about the CX index, it measures ease, effectiveness, and emotion. But if we focus on ease and effectiveness, we can eliminate negative emotions such as frustration and annoyance, right? So you're kind of coming at it through the back door here instead of taking it on kind of head first. So again, sometimes that best place to start is by eliminating the conditions for a poor interaction, and then more naturally a pleasant interaction will follow from that.
And and like I have to ask this, how would you make that interaction easier if you're a brand? Like what are the steps that one would take?
Yeah, the first thing you got to do is journey mapping. I mean, everything
Okay.
has to start with that. And the good news when you look at journey mapping, that's going to apply to all of your channels and all of your interactions. So I don't know if you're familiar with journey maps, Brian, but in essence, what you do is you create this idea of personas and you say, okay, this is really from people first learning about your product, discovering your product, all the way through purchasing and support after. But one of the most critical parts of putting together a journey map is mapping customers' emotion throughout that experience. So now we can quickly start to focus in where are the pain points in our interaction. So it may be, hey, Bob's a technically savvy buyer, for example, is maybe one of your personas, right?
Yeah.
And Bob comes to your website to troubleshoot an issue he's having with his TV. We're going to track Bob and say, Bob was pretty annoyed because he couldn't find the answer, right? He searched for 30 minutes. He didn't get what he needed. Uh, that's really where you've got to start is with a journey map, measuring those emotions, understanding where frustration occurs today. And some of it can even be things like you may have a website experience that's awesome for 80% of your consumers, but 20% are like, I want to be able to pick up the phone, but maybe you force them to use the website to do something. So you got to look for those things as well, right? It's really, again, that back to radical personalization, right? You cannot force people into one approach. You cannot force people into one method. You need to really be thinking about how to deploy many different methods for them to solve that problem.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to getting deep in the weeds with personalization, when consumers are interacting with a brand, what are some of those ways that one can, or I should say, a brand can really take it to the next step of personalization? Maybe some
Yeah.
examples that you've seen too.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of that is like, let's say you just talked about, we don't get celebrated often in emails, right? So maybe you
Yeah.
get an email that says, thank you for being a customer this last year, and here's a 10% off coupon. Okay, that's very generalized. Now, what happens if we start to say things like, hey, thank you be for a customer this year. Here's a 10% off coupon, and here are 4 or 5 products we think you'd really enjoy, right?
Yep.
That's that next level of personalization. The other thing I would say too, when you look at personalization, and really that starts to uncover that next level of it, is I talked about these AI tools coming in. Typically, we measure with journey maps. We have a very limited number of personas, limited number of consumers we're tracking and checking in on. We're starting to see now with these AI tools the uh, ability to manage sentiment in real time across all interactions, across all channels, and across all
Yep.
intents. So this is another way you take your personalization journey to the next level is basically say, okay, you know, using all of this data, we're going to start to create better understanding of clusters of our customers, right? As opposed to these personas that we kind of made up as part of a customer journey, which there's
Yep.
some scientific basis in that, but the reality is some of it is made up, right? To real clusters based on data, and then track those clusters throughout interactions to say, okay, next time customer B comes in that fits this very specific smaller cluster, we know they're going to get frustrated. Typically, that cohort of people is going to get frustrated if we suggest to them to try to use a chat bot. They'd much rather have us suggest to them to use a phone call. So now we start pushing people through proactive communication to the paths that create the most delight for them, right? So it's understanding where they fit, understanding what paths create the most positive emotions for them, and then also using proactive communication to help make them aware of the paths that are most likely to create positive emotions for them.
We there's a session with a company called QA. I should get this right. Q. Oh boy, QAI. That's what it is. Um, and they were talking about real time. They do real time sentiment analysis on customers, and I think it's just like super interesting because it is a pivot of segmentation, right? Because to your point earlier, you think of segmentation as, all right, these are our top 20 customers, these are our top 50 customers, top 100 customers. But all of a sudden, if you have the right data in place in real time, you could be like, oh no, these are the most important customers at this point in time based on their past 5 interactions with us has all been negative, right? And so then to your point, here's how we'll personalize their next step, which is a really fascinating way to think about, how customer experience can look like in the near future and even in the current present right now.
Yeah, the other thing too you have to recognize is sentiment isn't the end all to be all. Certainly, that's
Yeah.
a good place to start. The other thing I would say is um, we're probably measuring the wrong way. NPS is the de facto measure for success or happiness. The reality is NPS measures an intent potentially to do something down the road. It doesn't actually measure satisfaction. We are big fans at Eclipse of something called customer effort score.
Okay.
Customer effort score actually is a better predictor of loyalty than NPS. And we're talking about up to 2x better at predicting customer loyalty than NPS. And really, what that's measuring, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that people like doing businesses with companies that are easy to do business with. So, what is it measuring? It's measuring a very important question. How easy was it for you to do X? How easy was it for you to use our website to find information? How easy was it for you to solve your problem through our chatbot? How easy was it for you to purchase an item from us? Now you've got a much lower level of granularity that creates better understanding and a much better measure for success that's going to be more predictive of loyalty.
Yeah. You customer effort score. I don't know if it was created by, but I know that Matt Dickson, our keynote speaker, is the one that really talked about that first and foremost. And so that's super interesting that you guys also follow that model as well.
I just follow the data. So the data tells me it's better at predicting loyalty than NPS. And it makes sense to me as well, right? It also resonates personally with me.
It is. And again, loyalty is, it's I think it is one that everyone, at least in customer retention and customer experience, can relate to, and really is trying to improve at the end of the day. Okay, so I'm just going to go back really quick because you kind of dangled this carrot in front of me, and so it would be odd and strange not to ask you. You talked about the 7 deadly sins.
Yes.
All right. So what do you mean by that? Is that something that you have also created? Is this data as
It
well, or
is.
is this something different?
This is an Eclipse creation, certainly through the experience of what we've seen, and again, part of my own personal experience of building. Look, I hate to pin my accolades, but an award-winning
You could do
CX
it.
leader, right? So let's talk about 2, because I think this is an important part of eliminating frustration, creating better personalization, and creating better emotion. So one of the ones we talk about is know the location of your circuit breakers. So what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
Just like in real life, circuit breakers are tripped to prevent us from doing harm, right? And in the case of digital interactions, we need to make sure we trip our circuit breakers before we do harm to a customer. So let's talk about that in very practical terms. The easiest way to think about this is just because something is automated doesn't mean it has to be used in every instance. So let me give you a personal story of what I'm talking about. A big cable company, we all know who it is. I'm not going to pick on people here, but consistently does not score well on CX surveys. I moved into a house, they put in service for me. And this happened about 3 years ago. I was getting terrible speeds intermittently, outages, all kinds of stuff. So long story short, they came out to my house 5 different times, always replacing equipment outside of my home. right? At first it was, it's your fault. Then I finally got them to come out here and it was like, oh shoot, it's not your fault. The signal coming in is bad. And they kept going further and further upstream every time they come out. But every single time they try something, oh, they check it real quick. Oh, it looks fine. Away they go, right? So a couple days later, same problems come back. I got to pick up the phone. The first thing they make you do prior to being able to talk to anybody or an agent is they say, we must send a diagnostic and reset signal to your modem. And we will not talk to you until that's done. And that's a 10 to 15 minute process. Then after you go through that, then it's talk to level 1 support. Now at this point, they've been to my house 5 times. They know the problem is not my modem, but they're forcing me to use a tool that's not going to solve for my problem. And they're forcing me to talk to level 1 tech support agents who the first thing they're going to say to me is unplug your modem, which is not going to fix my problem, right? This is where a circuit breaker should have come in and said, oh my gosh, we replaced all kinds of equipment around this guy's house. This is the 4th time we've had this issue. Let's get them right to level 3 tech support.
Yep.
That's radical personalization, right?
Yep.
Understanding my previous interactions, understanding the source of my problem, and guiding me to the right path to get a resolution instead of making me go through a bunch of steps that aren't going to solve my problem.
I want to ask can I ask a quick question, Matt?
Yeah.
That we don't have, or I should say, I don't have this opportunity very many times, but I know exactly the situation that you are going, or you went through, and I'm going to assume that our audience knows exactly that situation with a company. And again, this is not to zero out this company, but with a company that has the resources and money to deal with it. Like, in your opinion, why hasn't something like that been solved yet? Like, it's kind of eye-opening and mind-blowing for me, and I can't wrap my head around it. But from your mind, like, why does that still exist?
Number one problem most companies have is they do not have their data that lives in one place that's accessible to all their systems. And I will say this for agents as well. So how do you create radical personalization when part of the transactions or interactions are in this system, part are here, they don't talk to one another, they're not cleansed, they're not brought together in a consolidated fashion. So the first step into creating world-class customer experience, and by the way, I can promise you Amazon did this from day one. All of your data is sitting in a data lake somewhere. It all goes through a data cleansing pipeline. When you call Brian, they probably know exactly what you've been searching for online. They know what you've purchased. They know everything is in motion, where it's at. So until you bring that data together, radical personalization is a very, very difficult thing to do. So you've got to start with a good CRM strategy. You've got to start with a good data lake strategy. That is really one of the key first steps in radical personalization.
Oh, that's beautiful. Is there anything else that we haven't touched upon yet?
Yeah, I'll hit on
Matt, you want to hit on?
Second of the 7 deadly sins I want to talk about. We're not going to go through all 7, I promise. If you want to look for that article, it's actually in Forbes. I think at that time we were calling it 7 mistakes of automation, but now we call it the 7 deadly sins.
So don't search 7 deadly sins, Matt Dickson.
Yeah, I do too. So if you search for my names on Forbes, it'll pop up. So if you want to read more, please go search out there or reach out to me directly. Happy to have that discussion. The other one I talked about, and it's really related to that previous point, is not knowing the location of your exit rows. So just like in a plane, when things go wrong, we need brightly lit exit rows that everybody knows where to go to, right? So again, I'm not ashamed to admit, Brian, well, I'll be curious if you've gone through this or how much of the people listening have. Have you ever yelled agent at a phone, at an IVR?
Yes, 100%. And I always thought that 0, 0, 0, 0, 0,
right?
0. Yeah.
Guess what? This is the point, is you've got people desperately trying to eject themselves from AI jail, eject themselves from automation jail, and we're not giving them ways to do that. So again, this is where we've got to, and part of that is we get caught in the IVR maze. Or in my example, I'll go back to this, picking on this poor company that I won't say their name. But why is it when I call, the first thing I get in IVR is, if you want help with your television service, press 1. If you want help with your phone service, press 2. If you want help with your internet service, press 3. I only have internet service.
Right.
How about you dump me right into the part of your IVR that's going to service me? Or based on, again, my previous example of, boy, I was having some real issues. How about you get me all the way out, right? But that's the problem here is we're dumping people into IVR prompts that don't make sense for them, creates more touches, more taps. We're making it harder and harder for them to get out of that endless maze of automation. And we're also not being good flight attendants. We're not pointing out the exit rows, right? We're not reacting in real time to say, boy, this interaction, we're seeing a lot of negative sentiment. We're seeing a lot of frustration. How about if I ask you, would you like me to connect you to an agent? And get them to the front of the queue, by the way, right? Because they've already spent 20 minutes frustrated with your self-service tools. Get them right to the front of the queue, right? So again, that's the idea of how do we radically personalize those experiences to know that for this one person, not universally, but for this one person, we're going down the wrong path. And here's how we course correct quickly.
I love that. So I'm going to recap really quick and tell me what I got wrong here. So we got to get to radical personalization, and maybe one way to think about radical personalization is like, hey, how can we create 29 positive responses, positive radical personalized responses to say one negative response? And in order to get there, it's all about making sure you have the right customer data in place and centralizing that customer data that an AI tool or whatever that you would need has access and can analyze, and it's all actually data that you can utilize and clean together. And am I missing anything? Is that
No,
kind of what we talked about right here?
certainly the place to start. And again, you got to make this available to your agents too. We
And
cannot
that's
forget that agents are part of your digital interactions as well, right? So, and by the way, it'll make your voice channel better too,
yeah,
right? So, how about things like next best actions, right? Like those are all things, once you get all your data into one place, you have it cleansed properly, you've created insights from it using AI tools. You've created better guidance for your automated tools and your agents, next best actions, for example.
yeah,
All of those things kind of come out of that. And that's where, again, we create delightful experiences. It was easy for me to do something with them. It only took a minute. Those are the things we want to hear, right?
yeah,
Unfortunately, we're building a more and more Byzantine system that people are getting the opposite of that right now, which is they made me use this self-service thing that didn't help my problem. I didn't know how to get to an agent, and I just gave up.
yeah. No, that's great. Well, beautiful. Thank you so much, Matt, for your time, for the content that you're providing here today. I wish you the best, and thanks for all the help here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
All right, bye, everyone.